Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The strategic desperation that defined the German High Command's final gamble in the winter of 1944 was underpinned by a logistical nightmare that rendered the ambitious goals of Operation Wacht dem Rhein almost purely delusional from its inception. As the Allied forces squeezed the Third Reich from both the east and the west, the German military machine, once the pioneer of mechanized blitzkrieg, found itself struggling to find the literal fuel required to keep its remaining panzers moving. The Ardennes Offensive, launched on December 16, 1944, was Adolf Hitler's attempt to split the British and American armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp, thereby forcing a negotiated peace. However, the plan relied on a critical and highly improbable variable: the capture of Allied fuel dumps. It was during this frantic push that a high-ranking German officer, often identified in historical analysis as being part of the elite Kampfgruppe Piper or associated with the upper echelons of the 1st SS Panzer Division, encountered a massive American fuel depot containing over 50,000 gallons of gasoline. The realization that followed was not one of triumph, but of profound, crushing despair. Seeing the sheer abundance, quality, and casual accessibility of the American liquid gold made it undeniably clear that Germany was not merely fighting an army, but an industrial titan whose resources were so vast that the German effort was essentially a medieval charge against a modern fortress. To understand the weight of this realization, one must first examine the catastrophic state of German oil production in late 1944. Since the loss of the Ploiesti oil fields in Romania to the Soviet Union in August 1944, the Reich had become almost entirely dependent on synthetic oil produced from coal at plants like Leuna and Brux. These plants were the primary targets of the Allied oil campaign, a systematic strategic bombing effort led by General Karl Spaatz of the United States Strategic Air Forces. By the autumn of 1944, German fuel production had plummeted by over 90%. Panzer divisions that required thousands of gallons of fuel just to travel a few dozen miles were being issued only fractions of their requirements. Tanks were being towed by horses to their jumping-off points to save every drop of gasoline for the actual assault. In this context, the Ardennes Offensive was a fuel-neutral plan. It was mathematically impossible for the German tanks to reach Antwerp unless they fueled themselves with captured American supplies along the way. The German colonel in question, leading his units through the frozen, narrow trails of the Ardennes, was acutely aware that his King Tigers and Panthers were operating on fumes, their progress measured not in kilometers but in the ticking of a dry fuel gauge. When the German units breached the initial American lines and pushed toward the town of Stavelot and the surrounding Belgian countryside, they came upon one of the first United States Army's massive fuel dumps. The sight was staggering. Thousands upon thousands of 5-gallon jerry cans, ironically a design the Americans had copied from the Germans earlier in the war, were stacked in neat, seemingly endless rows. This particular depot held over 50,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline, enough to refuel a significant portion of a panzer regiment. However, as the German colonel inspected the site, the psychological blow was far more damaging than the tactical gain. He observed that the Americans had so much fuel that they had not even bothered to heavily fortify the position. It was simply one of many such dumps scattered across the rear echelons. More shockingly, in several instances during the retreat, American soldiers had simply poured the gasoline onto the roads and set it on fire to create temporary walls of flame to slow the German tanks. To an officer whose men were literally starving for fuel, the idea that the enemy could afford to burn tens of thousands of gallons just to buy 10 minutes of time was a revelation of a resource disparity that no amount of German will or superior engineering could overcome. The disparity extended beyond the volume of fuel to the very nature of the logistics. The German colonel noticed the standardization of the American equipment. Every truck, every jeep, and every tank used the same high-quality 80-octane fuel, which was transported with an efficiency that the Reich had never achieved even at its peak. The Americans utilized the Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system that moved supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front lines with assembly line precision. The German officer realized that while his army was regressing to horse-drawn logistics due to the lack of oil and the destruction of the rail networks, the Americans were operating a fully motorized, oil-fueled juggernaut. The realization was a cold, hard mathematical truth. Germany was fighting a 19th-century war of attrition against a 20th-century industrial machine. The capture of 50,000 gallons, which the colonel had hoped would be the salvation of his drive toward the Meuse River, instead became a mirror reflecting the inevitable total collapse of the Nazi war effort. As Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of the offensive, continued its push, the fuel crisis became the primary architect of its failure. Peiper's massive Tiger II tanks, weighing nearly 70 tons, were notoriously fuel-thirsty, consuming about 5 gallons for every mile traveled on difficult terrain. The narrow, muddy roads of the Ardennes increased this consumption significantly. When Peiper's troops reached the vicinity of Stoumont and La Gleize, they were once again stalled by empty tanks. The 50,000 gallons they had encountered earlier were either destroyed by the retreating Americans or were insufficient to sustain the momentum required to break out into the open plains beyond the Ardennes. The colonel's realization deepened as he saw American transport planes, C-47 Skytrains, dropping supplies to surrounded American units at Bastogne. The Allies had so much fuel and so much air capacity that they could deliver gasoline through the sky, while the Germans could not even move it a few miles down a road without it being interdicted by Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos. The psychological collapse of the German officer corps in the West was often catalyzed by these encounters with American material superiority. This was not the first time such a realization had occurred, but the scale of the fuel dumps in the Ardennes was the final proof. Earlier in the war, German officers had been shocked by the quality of American rations and the abundance of luxury items like chocolate and cigarettes in the pockets of American POWs. But fuel was the lifeblood of the panzer divisions, the very essence of the German military's identity. To see 50,000 gallons of it sitting in a forest, used by the Americans as if it were water, destroyed the myth of the New Order's efficiency. The colonel understood that for every gallon he captured, the Americans had 1 million more in reserve, backed by an untouched industrial heartland across the Atlantic. This was the moment the Texas farmer and the arsenal of democracy truly defeated the Prussian military tradition. It was the victory of the assembly line over the Tiger tank. The historical analysis of the Battle of the Bulge frequently highlights this specific logistical failure as the primary reason the German offensive ran out of gas, both literally and metaphorically. The German colonel's epiphany at the fuel dump was the quiet, internal version of the external collapse that would follow in early 1945. After the offensive stalled, the German units were forced to abandon hundreds of perfectly functional tanks simply because they had no fuel to move them back to their own lines. These ghost panzers littered the roads of Belgium, silent monuments to the industrial failure of the Third Reich. The colonel, if he survived the subsequent retreat or the eventual encirclement at La Gleize, carried with him the knowledge that the war had been lost in the factories of Detroit and the refineries of Texas long before the first shot was fired in the Ardennes. The impact of the Allied oil campaign cannot be overstated in this context. While the German colonel was staring at the American fuel, his own sources of supply were being systematically incinerated. Between May 1944 and the end of the year, the USAAF and the RAF had dropped over 200,000 tons of bombs on German oil targets. The German synthetic oil industry was in ruins, and the efforts of Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, to rebuild the plants were being thwarted by the double-tap bombing strategy, where the Allies would wait for a plant to be partially repaired before bombing it again. This created a permanent fuel ceiling for the German military. No matter how many men they conscripted or how many tanks they built, they could never exceed the amount of fuel available to move them. The 50,000 gallons of captured fuel was a drop in an ocean that the Germans were no longer allowed to sail. Furthermore, the colonel's realization highlighted the failure of German intelligence. The OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, had underestimated the American ability to manage such vast stockpiles so close to the front. They had assumed that an attack would throw the American logistics into total disarray, allowing the Germans to easily seize the supplies they needed. Instead, the American logistical officers proved remarkably adept at evacuating or destroying their dumps. In Stavelot, members of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion and other support units demonstrated incredible initiative, using the very fuel the Germans coveted to create defensive barriers. This combination of material abundance and individual initiative was the secret weapon that the German colonel finally recognized. He saw that the Americans were not just decadent or inexperienced, but were masters of a new kind of warfare where logistics was the primary weapon of destruction. The story of the 50,000 gallons of fuel is more than a tactical anecdote. It is a fundamental lesson in the nature of total war. It illustrates the transition from the heroic era of warfare, where battles were thought to be won by the individual bravery of soldiers, to the industrial era, where victory is determined by the capacity to produce and distribute resources. The German colonel, a product of a system that emphasized tactical brilliance and the cult of the offensive, was humbled by the sheer weight of American production. He realized that his army was an anachronism. The King Tiger, with its complex transmission and massive weight, was a masterpiece of engineering that was fundamentally unsuited for a war where the enemy could produce 10 simpler, more reliable tanks for every one German heavy. And more importantly, the enemy could provide those 10 tanks with all the fuel they needed, while the King Tiger was destined to become a very expensive stationary bunker. As the Ardennes offensive ground to a halt and the Allied counterattacks began to squeeze the German salient, the colonel's despair likely spread through the ranks. Soldiers began to hear rumors of the vast American depots and the endless supply of food and equipment. This led to a collapse in morale that accelerated the disintegration of the German front in early 1945. The realization that the war is lost often happens at the top levels of command through a look at a spreadsheet or a map, but for the frontline officer, it happens when he sees a 50,000-gallon fuel dump that the enemy doesn't even seem to miss. It is the realization that you are not just losing the game, but that the opponent is playing with a different set of rules and an infinite supply of pieces. The legacy of this logistical disparity remained a core study for post-war military theorists. It led to the doctrine of sustainment that defines modern Western militaries. The American ability to turn survival rates upside down through medicine and to keep their wrong coast deception alive through the art of deception was all fueled by the same industrial engine that produced those 50,000 gallons of gasoline. The German colonel's realization was the final, tragic acknowledgement of the reality that Joseph Stalin had once famously summarized: the war was won by British brains, American brawn, and Russian blood. In the Ardennes, the American brawn was most visible in the form of liquid fuel, and its impact on the German psyche was the definitive end of the myth of German invincibility. The colonel's observation of the jerry cans is particularly ironic. The Wehrmacht had developed the superior, stamped metal, 5-gallon fuel container in the 1930s, designed for easy handling and efficient stacking. The British and Americans had initially relied on flimsier, 4-gallon tin containers known as flimsies, which often leaked and were a major logistical liability during the North African campaign. However, once the Allies captured German jerry cans, they did what they did best. They refined the design for mass production and manufactured them by the tens of millions. By the time of the Ardennes offensive, the Americans had more German-style fuel cans than the Germans did. This ability to adopt, adapt, and outproduce the enemy's own technology was a recurring theme that the German colonel had to confront as he walked through the captured dump. The master race was being defeated by its own inventions, manufactured with a volume and quality that the Reich's strained economy could no longer match. The strategic consequences of this fuel shortage were felt in every decision made by Piper and his superiors. Because they could not afford to take the most logical or direct routes, which were often heavily defended or subject to Allied air observation, they were forced into the narrowest, most treacherous secondary roads. These roads further increased the mechanical wear on the tanks and the fuel consumption of the engines. It was a vicious cycle. The lack of fuel forced poor tactical choices, which in turn wasted more fuel. The 50,000 gallons the colonel saw represented the freedom of movement that his own army had lost. To an armored commander, the loss of mobility is the loss of his reason for being. Looking at that fuel, he wasn't just looking at gasoline. He was looking at the stolen mobility of his entire Panzer Corps. The colonel's realization also encompassed the human cost of the logistical failure. He knew that the lack of fuel meant that his wounded could not be evacuated quickly, that his supplies of food and ammunition could not be brought forward, and that his men would eventually be trapped in a pocket of their own making. The spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division was destined to become a cemetery of steel in the Belgian hills. This awareness turned the 50,000 gallons into a symbol of the Allied care for their own troops versus the German sacrifice of theirs. The Americans could afford to keep their men fed, fueled, and protected because their industry provided the margin of safety that the German soldier had not seen since 1941. By late December 1944, the weather cleared, and the Allied air forces, the Jabos, returned to the skies with a vengeance. For the German colonel, this was the final act. He watched as his remaining vehicles were hunted down from above, often while they were stationary, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. The American pilots didn't even have to be particularly accurate. They just had to hit the fuel trucks that were struggling to reach the front. The German oil pipe was being squeezed at both ends, the production was gone at the refineries, and the distribution was being severed on the roads. The 50,000 gallons in the depot became a mocking reminder of what could have been, a mirage of victory in a desert of defeat. In the post-war interrogations of German officers, many echoed the sentiments of this colonel. They spoke of the shock of seeing the American supply dumps and the material battle, Materialschlacht, that they could not win. They recognized that the Ardennes offensive was the last gasp of a dying regime, a desperate throw of the dice by a gambler who had already lost his shirt. The capture of American fuel was the only way the gamble could have paid off, but the reality of American abundance made that capture feel like stealing a bucket of water from a man who owned a lake. It didn't change the outcome. It only highlighted the magnitude of the disparity. The realization that Germany was doomed was not just a military conclusion, it was an economic and industrial one. The colonel saw that the American society was organized for victory in a way that Germany, despite its totalitarian control, was not. The American worker in Detroit, the refinery hand in Texas, and the dock worker in New York were all present in that 50,000-gallon dump. They were the ones who had won the war. The German colonel, standing in the cold Ardennes mud, finally understood that the New Order had been a hollow shell, and that the true power of the 20th century lay in the unleashed potential of a free industrial democracy. The story of the colonel and the fuel dump is often used by military historians to debunk the myth that the Battle of the Bulge was close. While it was a period of intense fighting and American heroism, the logistical reality ensured that the German success was always going to be temporary. The 50,000 gallons of fuel serve as the ultimate historical evidence of this fact. They represent the tipping point where the reality of the war finally broke through the layers of Nazi propaganda and the tactical brilliance of the German officer corps. From that moment on, for the men who knew the truth, the war was no longer about winning, it was only about how long the end would take. The colonel's despair also reflected the technological divergence between the two sides. The American tanks, like the Sherman, were designed for reliability and ease of maintenance, reflecting a mass production mindset. The German tanks, while individually more powerful, were over-engineered and difficult to maintain under battlefield conditions. This design philosophy was only sustainable if one had the fuel and parts to keep them running. Without fuel, the King Tiger was just a very heavy piece of scrap metal. The 50,000 gallons of gasoline were the software that the American hardware used to dominate the battlefield, while the German hardware was stuck with an empty battery error message. This historical episode also sheds light on the broader chain of evacuation and the medical advancements of the era. Because the Americans had the fuel and the transport, their golden hour for wounded soldiers was far more effective than the Germans. A wounded American had a high probability of being transported to a field hospital via jeep or ambulance, both fueled by that 80-octane gasoline. A wounded German soldier in the Ardennes was often left to wait for a horse-drawn cart or to be carried by hand, leading to much higher mortality rates. The 50,000 gallons of fuel thus saved American lives twice, once by powering the machines of war, and once by powering the machines of mercy. Ultimately, the German colonel's realization is a testament to the power of truth when it confronts ideology. He had been told the Americans were weak, that their industry was a sham, and that the U-boats had cut off their supplies. One look at a 50,000-gallon fuel dump told him everything he needed to know. The Third Reich had lost. The wrong coast had been guarded, the ruins were held by snipers, and the Texas farmer was destroying their tanks, but it was the liquid gold of the American refineries that finally shut the door on the German future. The Ardennes offensive ended in the snows of Belgium, but the soul of the German military died when its leaders realized that the enemy had enough gasoline to burn it for fun. The tactical details of the gasoline barriers at Stavelot are particularly evocative. At the Amblev River Bridge, American troops from the 202nd Engineer Combat Battalion and the 825th Tank Destroyer Battalion faced the lead elements of Kampfgruppe Piper. Realizing they couldn't stop the tanks with fire alone, they used a pipeline and local fuel stores to drench the road. When the first panzers approached, they set the fuel ablaze. The sight of a literal river of fire, fueled by the very substance the Germans were dying for, was the ultimate psychological warfare. For a German tanker, seeing the precious gasoline being wasted in this manner was a soul-crushing experience. It signaled that the Americans possessed such an excess of resources that they could weaponize the very thing the Germans needed for survival. This abundance allowed the Americans to be logistically aggressive. They didn't have to worry about the cost of a maneuver in terms of fuel. They only had to worry about its tactical effectiveness. This freedom allowed for the rapid movement of General George S. Patton's Third Army, which performed a legendary 90-degree turn and drove 100 miles in 3 days to relieve the pressure on the Ardennes. This maneuver required millions of gallons of fuel, all of which was available and delivered on time. The German colonel, watching the American counterattacks develop with such speed and fluidity, knew that his own static defense was no match for a motorized enemy that never had to stop for a refill. The story concludes with the total annihilation of the German strategic reserves. The Ardennes offensive cost Germany its last remaining tanks, its best remaining pilots, and its final reserves of fuel. By the time the Soviet Union launched the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, the German Eastern Front was defenseless. The doomed realization of the colonel had become a national reality. The 50,000 gallons of fuel remained a haunting memory of the time when the gap between the Reich's ambitions and its capabilities was finally and irrevocably exposed. The industrial might of the United States had not just defeated Germany, it had fundamentally redefined the requirements of world power. The 50,000-gallon discovery was not just an end but a beginning of a new world order where energy and logistics would become the primary currencies of geopolitical influence. The German colonel, in his moment of realization, was one of the first to witness the birth of the American century, a period defined by the same industrial and resource dominance he had seen in the Ardennes. The war continued for a few more months of bloody, unnecessary struggle, but for those who had seen the fuel dumps, the outcome was already written in the ledgers of the First U.S. Army. The Third Reich was a ghost, held together by the momentum of its past, while the United States was the future, fueled by the infinite potential of its oil and its industry. As the ruins of the Reich were eventually cleared and the cities rebuilt, the lesson of the fuel dump realization remained a cornerstone of military education. It serves as a reminder that the most brilliant tactical mind is helpless without a functioning supply chain. The German colonel's despair in the Ardennes is the mirror image of the Allied confidence in Normandy. Both were built on the same foundation, the presence or absence of the materials of war. The guard on the wrong coast and the sniper in the ruins were the drama of the war, but the 50,000 gallons of gasoline were its truth. The final irony of the colonel's realization is that while the Germans had invented the jerrycan to facilitate the mobility of their army, it was the Americans who used it to achieve the most mobile military force in history. The Texas farmer and the arsenal of democracy had taken the tools of their enemy and multiplied them by a factor of 100. The result was an unstoppable tide of steel and gasoline that washed away the remnants of the Nazi regime. The colonel, watching the American fuel flow like water, knew that no amount of courage could stem that tide. Germany was doomed not by a lack of soldiers, but by a lack of the liquid gold that powered the modern world. The narrative of the 50,000 gallons serves as a powerful metaphor for the entire conflict. It highlights the shift from a world of scarcity and struggle to a world of abundance and industrial management. The German military was the last and greatest representative of the old way of war, while the American military was the first of the new. The realization of the German colonel in the Ardennes was the moment these two worlds collided, and the result was the absolute and final destruction of the old. The fuel dump was the altar upon which the myth of German superiority was sacrificed, leaving only the cold reality of industrial defeat. In concluding this analysis, we must recognize that the German colonel's realization was the final, tragic bridge between the strategic planning of the OKW and the tactical reality of the front line. It was the moment the big map met the empty tank. The 50,000 gallons of U.S. fuel were the final evidence needed to close the case on the Second World War. The Allied victory was not just a military triumph, it was a logistical and industrial miracle that changed the nature of human history. The Colonel's despair remains a sobering reminder of the consequences of pursuing a war that your own industry cannot support, a lesson that remains as relevant in the 21st century as it was in the winter of 1944.